You know, a lot of times Christian nationalists like to point to Scripture in an attempt to say that we ought to submit to the will of Donald Trump because it's actually the will of God. At the top of the list of the Scripture they like to use is Romans 13, in which Paul writes a letter to the Christians in Rome and tells them that they ought to submit to authority because those authority figures are appointed by God, that they ought to pay their taxes, that they ought to generally keep quiet. Here's the thing, Paul was writing to Christians in Rome in the first century, not to us, and he was writing in a very specific context. You see, Paul thought that the world was going to end in his lifetime. He thought that Jesus was coming on back to clean everything up and to punish the Roman authorities who were oppressing his people. Spoiler alert, Paul was wrong. The world didn't end, and Jesus did not come on back. If Paul had known that his words would have been misconstrued by those in power to oppress others, he would have been horrified. This is one of the dangers of taking Scripture out of context and trying to apply it blindly to our situation. Early Christians were living under the heel of the Roman Empire. They were living under threat of oppression and persecution. That's why so many early Christians were crucified. In fact, the biblical text is one that is about loyalty to God, to love, to justice, over and against authority of an oppressive state. That's the lesson we should be learning from the biblical text.
That is Pastor Caleb J. Lyons of University Christian Church in San Diego, California. So ultimately, context matters, and you're taking the Bible out of context. And even when we are supposed to follow laws, let's take a look at what the book of Isaiah has to say in chapter 10. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievances which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, that they may rob them fatherless. And what will ye do in the day of visitation, and the desolation which shall come forth from far? To whom will ye flee for help? And where will ye leave your glory? Without me they shall bow down under the prisoners, and they shall fall under slain. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. You gotta take the Bible in context, because what you're doing is taking it out of context. You need to understand what exactly the scriptures talk about. Paul especially, everything Paul wrote is very opinion. 1 Corinthians 7 is like a great example of him admitting that he's writing everything not of God's opinion, but of his own opinion. So I would recommend that you would actually take your time to study the scriptures and study church history at its very finest. Anyways, my name is Adam Maris, left a Republican. Be sure to subscribe or you won't see my face again. Have a good day.